As promised, this is a continuation of the previous lecture in which we want to focus on the tail end of the 1920s and begin talking about the Great Depression. Unfortunately for President Herbert Hoover, the Great Depression occurred about 6 months into his term, 6 or 7 months into his first term of office and his only term of office. Had the Great Depression not occurred, and had it not been so severe, it is entirely possible that we would remember Herbert Hoover as one of our best presidents. He came to office with great acclaim. He had been the chairman during the early part of World War I of the Committee for the Relief of Belgium, and based on his extraordinary engineering ability. Let me back up to say he was a mining engineer who had made a fortune by his early 30s and retired to do public service. 1915-16, early 17, he was in charge of Belgian relief, did such a remarkable job that Woodrow Wilson asked him to become the U.S. Food Administrator, and he was able to both increase America's production of foodstuff and decrease America's consumption of fats, muscle proteins, and wheat, so that he could feed both the troops at the front, French, American, and English, as well as feed France and Belgium, and keep American food prices down. This is a pretty remarkable achievement. Based on that achievement, President Harding asked him to sit as Secretary of Commerce, and he did that until 1928. His sole detractor was Calvin Coolidge, who said that of Herbert Hoover, that man has been giving me advice for years, none of it good. Hoover and Coolidge did not see the role of government as being the same thing. How did Hoover see it? He saw it as that the role of government, particularly the Department of Commerce, was to get business corporations to regulate themselves in the interest of the nation and in the interest of long-term, what we might today call sustainable economies. He had a long, successful track record with what he called voluntary associationism, which was businesses working together in trade associations with the government for mutual benefit and growth. There was also in this voluntary associationism of Herbert Hoover's a place for workers and even their independent unions. By independent, I mean not subject to company control, to get on board. There's a place for them and their unions to get on board. And he wanted to continue, at least administratively, a lot of the progressive ideas of the 19 teens, and he wanted to stabilize long-term economic growth across the board. And he thought that businesses would do that for mutual benefit. Unfortunately, this all fell apart. About 6 months after he came to the office of president in March of 1929, having easily defeated the anti-prohibitionist Catholic and very New York mayor Al Smith. The causes of the Great Depression are varied and disputed. And the first thing that we have to talk about when we talk about the causes of the Great Depression is the crash of the stock market that occurred in October only of 1929. Pardon me. Let me say that the stock market crash was not in itself a cause of the Great Depression. What it did many economists and economic historians now maintain, was to trigger the Great Depression. It was one more thing that finally put the economy into enough of a tailspin and shocked it badly enough that, with other things and with other acts over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, the economy just could not recover. So the stock market crash may have triggered the Great Depression, but did not cause the Great Depression. There were other things. But let's look at the stock market crash. When we talk about a crash, we're talking about a significant loss of value in a short time period. The first fall of the stock market occurred on what's called Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. By the following Monday, stocks recovered just a little bit on speculation that, as had happened in the past, financiers would get together and buy up a lot of bad stock just to keep the market afloat. But those financiers did not do that. In fact, a number of them met and decided not to rescue the market. So the following Tuesday, October 29th, the market really crashed. And so by the end of that week, there was a 1 week drop of 40%, a loss of market value. By July of 1932, the Dow Industrial Index had lost 89% of its value. That means that for every $100 of value that it had had in September and early October of 1929, it had 11 cents left by July of 1932. Now, that's a problem in and of itself, but it's also an indication of other problems across the economy. We have to ask ourselves, was speculation in the stock market a cause of the crash, or even a cause of the continued crash that seems to have triggered the Great Depression? There was an oversupply of cash in the economy, brought on in large part by the Calvin Coolidge reductions in tax rates and in estate taxes in the mid-1920s, in 24 and 26. This led to a stock bubble and buying on margin, which is speculation, pure and simple, led to a stock bubble. Now, there were only about 1 million buyers in the market, but some of these were very large buyers. And unfortunately, many of the smaller buyers couldn't afford the way they were buying stock. Now, buying on margin is the notion that person X would buy stock with borrowed money, sometimes up to 90% borrowed, in hopes that by holding the stock for a little while, it would appreciate so much that they could get the borrowed money back out of it when they sold it, and could also get enough to have a little bit of a profit. So they would put down 10%, borrow 90%, buy a stock, hope that it appreciated enough to pay off the loan and to give them a little bit of a profit, as well as to recover their money. And it did this for 2 or 3 years before the market crashed. The crash ultimately caused people to lose confidence in the market as an engine of wealth or an engine of stability. But it was the structural weaknesses of the economy that were more important than the crash in creating the Great Depression. What were some of these structural weaknesses? Well, the most important were the so-called sick industries, and this was a known problem. The textile industry did not modernize. It was 30, 35, 40, 45 years old, and using old technology and relying on extremely cheap labor, either immigrant labor in the North or Southern white labor in the South. So it didn't feel like it had to modernize. but it was a large, large industry. Another sick industry was agriculture. It faltered in the wake of the European agricultural recovery from World War I, and without government assistance, it did not pay to farm. People simply lost their money in farming. Now, another structural weakness in the economy, besides the sick industries, were that profits far outstripped wages during these boom years of 1922 to 1929. One of the things that keep profits from outstripping wages too far, that keep money from accumulating in the upper end of the economic spectrum, and so to be spent on things that don't necessarily boost the economy across the board, are unions. Unions, by demanding increased wages, then move profits from a concentration in the upper end of the economy, in the owner class or the rentier class, into the working class of the economy. But unions were hobbled by not only a concerted effort on the part of the federal government to keep them as small as possible, but also by welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism was business largesse practiced in the manufacturing sector in order to relieve workers from the desire to have unions. So instead of butting heads with workers, management often provided workers with those ameliorations, including slightly higher wages, but also things like medical care and in some cases vacation time, profit sharing, things like that, that unions tended to try to get in contracts. Also under welfare capitalism was this concept of company unions. Rather than having a union that was worker controlled, then the company would set up a union that it could have some control over. Also, unions were hobbled by Supreme Court decisions, particularly those that allowed the so-called yellow dog contract, in which an employment contract signed between a business and an individual worker would stipulate that that worker could be fired for joining a union or doing any kind of union activity. With these structural weaknesses, though, we see an overconcentration of wealth in the upper end of the economy, and that means that people are actually living closer to the margin of personal poverty than it appears from measures that measure simply money in the economy. Eventually, however, after the stock market crashed, business and government made some severe errors in the economy. Now, business less so than government. The federal government spurred the Depression on, probably turning what would have been a pretty severe recession into a depression under Herbert Hoover, first by the Federal Reserve System tightening the money supply as the Depression began. The Federal Reserve tightened the money supply by 38%. That means basically taking 38% of the money out of circulation by demanding that its member banks hold that money in reserve. The Hoover administration also believed, and as did the Roosevelt administration later, that balancing the budget would restore business confidence. The Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration later both believed that the problem was business confidence. Well, it wasn't business confidence. The problem was there wasn't enough money in the economy. And Hoover, trying to balance the budget in 1931, then made the economy worse. The private economy, the non-governmental economy, did not have enough demand in it, and the governmental economy decided it would not go shopping. And so that just sent the whole economy into a free fall. Furthermore, the U.S. Depression was part of a worldwide problem. England and Germany had not recovered from World War I. In fact, England barely felt the Depression. They had been in a depressed economy since 1915, and so didn't really feel it. The Germans had high hopes for the economy, but were buffeted by political winds that some were economic, some were just sheerly political, using the economy as a hot button issue. Furthermore, and part of this worldwide economic problem was that major banks were too intertwined, and they were not regulated enough, so that when one fell, it took the others with it. That means that they were loaning each other substantial amounts of money based on the idea that they would pay each other back, and none of them could withstand the failure of any of the other ones. And by this, I'm talking about the European national banks in particular. For example, in 1931, the Austrian state bank called the Credit Anhalt had to stop specie payment. It couldn't pay its notes. It was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. That meant it couldn't pay the Bank of France, which couldn't pay the Bank of England, which couldn't pay its debts. And so that really reignited the Great Depression and sent the economy tumbling, American economy as well as Western world economy, just tumbling directly into the abyss of January of 32. Hoover's response was also a problem. He stressed private relief for far too long. And he stressed voluntary measures for far too long, believing that if the people just pulled together, then everything would be okay, but it wasn't. He pressured businesses to refrain from layoffs and from wage cuts, and they indeed tried to do that. He also believed that private relief agencies like churches could provide for those few people who actually fell into real poverty and actual hunger. But the economy continued not just to sputter along, but to fall off of a cliff. And so these private charities were simply overwhelmed. And many of them could not come anywhere near providing food and shelter and clothing for those people who had no other option. Now, this is not to say that the economy took everybody down with it, but it took a lot of people down with it. That we believe that we don't have any real measures, but we believe that unemployment at the worst of the bad economy was approximately 33%, that it averaged over the course of the Depression about 25%, but also that doesn't count underemployment, what we would call people who wanted to work full-time but had to work part-time. And in many cases, all the members of a family would be working, but they still wouldn't be making the same amount of money as one family member had before the fall of the economy. So federal relief, because Hoover stressed private relief, his federal relief efforts were too small. He applied government pressure by creating the Emergency Committee for Employment in 1930. For unemployment in 1930, trying to come up with ways to spur employability. But that was a little too little, a little too late. He created the National Credit Corporation in 1931, which allowed the government, the federal government, to act as something of a bank of last resort, a lender of last resort. And then by 1932, he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was more than just a lender of last resort. It specifically aimed $2 billion of loans to banks, railroads, and industries. And by June of 1932, it made loans to government bodies, local government bodies, and state government bodies to finance public work, but no relief for unemployment. There was no direct payment for unemployment under Herbert Hoover's response. And Hoover began to be seen as being a friend of business, but a foe of the common man. And this, once private and even public relief failed, then Herbert Hoover was blamed for people's personal troubles. And I mean that many people blamed him specifically for their personal problems, plus that became kind of a standard response, at least among poorer people or people who were economically marginalized or severely worried. This led to quaint local practices like calling shanty towns Hoovervilles. Hooverville was a shack settlement of unemployed and homeless people, usually on the edge of a town. They would take packing crates, and instead of living on the streets, they'd live in an area, and these areas would be called Hoovervilles. This was a very prominent reminder of people's misery, and pretty stark reminder of people's misery. So even if you yourself were only marginally tagged by the Depression, you probably knew somebody who lived in a Hooverville if the town was large enough that you lived in, or you went past a Hooverville, or the newspaper talked about the Hoovervilles. And these were places to be feared that you would eventually end up in them as well. But probably the most significant failure of leadership, I guess, on the part of Hoover, and the thing that he paid for most dearly, was the problem with the so-called bonus march, the bonus army of 1932. And this could not have happened at a worse time. It was right before the 1932 presidential campaign season opened on Labor Day. And so from May until July of 1932, veterans from across the U.S. marched on Washington, D.C. to pressure the government to pay the 20-year bonus that they had promised the 20-year bonus that they had passed in 1925 to be paid in 1945 to compensate members of the American Expeditionary Force, that is veterans of World War I, for being in the Army when if they had stayed home, they would have made a bunch more money. Let me phrase that a different way. Men who went to war in World War I were paid less by the Army than they probably would have made had they worked at comparable jobs with comparable skills in war industries. In 1925, after tremendous pressure, Congress said, we will pay you a bonus in 1945 for your service in World War I. This would have acted for most of them like a retirement nest egg. But when the Depression really hit, these veterans, many veterans from across the U.S. said, we want that bonus now. We'd love to have it in 1945, but we need the money now. And so in that time-honored tradition of political marching, they marched on Washington, D.C., and they set up camp on Anacostia Flat, and they took over a number of derelict government wooden buildings in downtown. The government was bad about clearing out downtown of its old buildings. So there were a lot of derelict buildings, and these guys simply occupied them. Um, they marched on Congress. Congress refused to pass any bills. This was, I mean, you know how it is. Some congressmen wanted to do it, some did not. Hoover said, we got to get rid of these guys. It's just too much. They're not going to get anywhere. About half of them had gone home by July because it was obvious that they weren't going to get anything from Congress. But about half of them stayed, and they intended on continuing their occupation of Anacostia Flats. But on July 28th and 29th, under a military force commanded by Douglas MacArthur, the marchers were cleared from Anacostia Flats in what boiled down to an attack, including tanks. MacArthur burned the camp against Hoover's orders, but MacArthur didn't pay much attention to presidents anyway. Two members of this so-called bonus expeditionary force were killed outright. A number of others were wounded. One baby who was there was asphyxiated, and one mother miscarried. Now, this doesn't sound like a big problem until you realize that this was in the nation's capital, and it was an attack by a military force on civilians who, at that moment, were not actively protesting. They were trespassing. They weren't protesting. Anyway, this was a terrible thing to have occurred. The pictures were stunning for their time. Hoover was distraught. He did not tell MacArthur to do this, but he didn't disown MacArthur either. And so this landed in his lap. And in large part because of his failures of leadership and being perceived as somebody who was both hard against poor people and didn't care about the poor, then Franklin Roosevelt found himself elected president in that year's presidential election. Well, this ends the lecture, but let me show you 3 slides of images. Here's some images of the bonus army. You can see they're marching on D.C. in the upper left. You can see a camp, and down below Joe Shanley in front of the shack that he had built for himself. This camp was also called a Hooverville. And then you can see the image in the lower left of the camp in Anacostia Flats being burned by the military. And if you look closely, you might be able to see in the right of that picture what looks like a jet of water being sprayed on this burning building in front of you. Anyway, this is an image from the newspaper, and Americans were simply not accustomed to this kind of violence and had not been accustomed really to it since the industrial warfare of the late 19th century. Here's a soup kitchen. A private individual. This private individual's name was Al Capone. Set up a free soup kitchen, free coffee and donuts for the unemployed in Chicago. And a federal Farm Security Administration photograph showing a Christmas dinner in Iowa in 1935 for a family. Some of these photographs are poised in order to bring out their poignancy, but they do show that people weren't as well-to-do as most Americans thought they ought to be. Well, this concludes our lecture about the Great Depression, and thank you very much for your attention.